In the heart of New York City, beneath the bright lights and skyscrapers, a shadow empire was built, an empire not of politicians or businessmen but of gangsters. These men didn't collect taxes through laws or institutions, they collected through fear. This was the mob tax, the invisible fee imposed by the mafia on every corner of New York's economy. From construction sites to restaurants, docks to nightclubs, everyone paid, because in the city that never sleeps, the mafia owned the night. The roots of the mob tax reach back to the early 20th century, when Italian immigrants struggling to survive in the harsh neighborhoods of Little Italy and Brooklyn formed secret brotherhoods for protection. Out of these street gangs rose 5 powerful families, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. Together, they became known as the Five Families, the most feared and powerful criminal syndicate in American history. The mastermind behind this organization was Charles Lucky Luciano, who in the 1930s created the Commission, a council that united the 5 families under one governing body. Luciano's genius was his ability to turn chaos into structure, to turn gang wars into business meetings. With the Commission in place, the Mafia became more than a criminal enterprise. It became a corporation, one that taxed illegal profits and later, legitimate industries. The mob tax was their most effective tool of power. It wasn't written in any book, but everyone in the underworld knew the rules. If you wanted to operate in New York, you paid your tribute to the family that controlled your territory. Whether it was a neighborhood bar, a construction firm, or a trucking company, the Mafia took a piece of every dollar earned. This tax guaranteed protection, political connections, and the peace of mind that no one would cause trouble for your business, at least not without the family's permission. The genius of the mob tax lay in its invisibility. There were no invoices, no contracts, no records. Payments were often disguised as consulting fees or union dues, but everyone knew what they really were, the cost of doing business under Mafia control. This shadow economy quietly grew into a multi-million-dollar empire, all untouchable by law. By the 1950s, the Mafia had expanded its influence far beyond gambling and bootlegging. The 5 families realized that the real power wasn't just in crime, it was in controlling labor. Whoever controlled the unions controlled the flow of money across the city. Through infiltration of powerful labor organizations like the Teamsters and the Longshoremen's Union, the Mafia dictated which companies won contracts, which workers got jobs, and how much they would be paid. They even controlled the delivery of concrete and steel used to build New York's skyscrapers. The construction industry became one of the Mafia's most profitable rackets. Every major project, from office towers to highways, carried a hidden price, the mob's cut. Developers who refused to play along found their worksites vandalized, their trucks hijacked, or worse, their lives threatened. But for those who cooperated, the families ensured that materials arrived on time, labor disputes vanished, and city inspectors looked the other way. The mob tax wasn't just enforced through violence, it was maintained through loyalty and fear. The Mafia's code of silence, or omerta, was sacred. Breaking it meant death. This culture of fear ensured that even those who despised the Mafia often complied, because the alternative was too dangerous to imagine. For small business owners, the mob's offer of protection was both a curse and a necessity. They didn't pay because they wanted to, they paid because they had to. As the decades passed, the mob tax became institutionalized. It wasn't just a criminal operation anymore, it was a system woven into the fabric of the city. Even legitimate businesses, politicians, and union bosses played along. The Mafia's reach extended into the police department, City Hall, and Wall Street. Through a mix of bribery, intimidation, and influence, the 5 families made sure that their tax kept flowing without interruption. Each family carved out its territory. The Genovese family, often called the Ivy League of organized crime, controlled much of the city's labor racketeering. The Gambino family, under legendary bosses like Carlo Gambino, dominated trucking, ports, and construction. The Lucchese and Colombo families managed unions and loan sharking, while the Bonanno family, the oldest of the 5, controlled parts of Brooklyn and Queens. Together, they balanced power through the Commission, ensuring no one family overstepped its boundaries without permission. But behind the suits, cigars, and backroom meetings, there was always blood. Enforcing the mob tax required enforcers, men like Albert Anastasia, known as the Lord High Executioner, who ruled through pure terror. If a business owner dared to refuse payment or report extortion to the police, his store might mysteriously burn down, his trucks destroyed, or his body found in an alley. Violence was the ultimate reminder of who really controlled the city. By the 1970s, the Mafia's mob tax had reached its golden age. Billions of dollars flowed through Mafia-controlled unions and businesses every year. The five families were no longer just criminals, they were silent partners in New York's economy. From the skyscrapers rising over Manhattan to the garbage trucks rumbling through Brooklyn, everything had a price, and the Mafia collected its share. To many in the working class, the mob's presence was both feared and respected. In some neighborhoods, Mafia figures were seen as protectors, men who provided loans when banks wouldn't, who settled disputes faster than any court, and who made sure no outsider caused trouble. But this romantic image of the Mafia hid a darker truth: corruption, violence, and greed were the foundations of their empire. The same system that gave some people opportunity destroyed countless others who got in the way. By the late 1970s, however, cracks began to form. Law enforcement was starting to catch on. Federal investigators noticed how construction bids were fixed, how unions seemed controlled by unseen hands, and how ordinary businessmen paid fees for no reason. The mob tax, once invisible, was now under the microscope. What began as whispers in the underworld was about to explode into one of the biggest legal showdowns in American history. The five families had ruled New York for nearly half a century. But as surveillance, wiretaps, and the RICO Act closed in, their empire of silent taxation was about to crumble. The mob had taxed New York for decades, but soon, justice would come to collect its own. CO title: NYC Mafia's Mob Tax. How the Five Families Took Over New York. American Godfathers S1. CO description: explore how New York's five families created the mob tax, an underground system that turned crime into business and made the Mafia richer than ever. Keywords: NYC Mafia, mob tax, five families, American Godfathers, organized crime, New York Mafia history, Lucky Luciano, Mafia Commission, labor racketeering, Gambino family, Genovese family, true crime. Hashtags: hashtag Mafia history, hashtag NYC mob, hashtag five families, hashtag American Godfathers, hashtag mob tax, hashtag organized crime, hashtag true crime, hashtag Lucky Luciano, hashtag NYC history, hashtag Gambino family. By the late 1970s, the Mafia's mob tax had become one of the most profitable systems of organized crime in history. For nearly 5 decades, New York City had lived under the silent control of the five families, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo organizations. Together, they built a financial empire that thrived on fear, loyalty, and corruption. But as the city modernized, so did the law. The same system that made the Mafia rich was now making them vulnerable. Hidden payments, coded conversations, and, off the books, deals could no longer stay secret in an era of wiretaps and surveillance. What had once been an invisible empire was about to be exposed in broad daylight. The turning point came with the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act of 1970. This new federal law gave prosecutors a weapon that would change the game forever. Instead of going after individual crimes like murder or extortion, RICO allowed the government to target entire organizations. If a crime could be connected to a larger criminal enterprise, every member of that enterprise could be charged. For the Mafia, this was devastating. The structure that had once protected bosses, their layers of soldiers, capos, and underbosses, now became evidence against them. Every payment collected, every coded conversation, every mob tax transaction could be tied directly to the top. By the early 1980s, the FBI and federal prosecutors began focusing on labor racketeering, the very backbone of the mob tax system. Agents discovered that Mafia-controlled unions were extorting millions from construction companies, trucking firms, and waterfront businesses. Developers paid inflated costs just to keep their projects running. The Mafia's tax had quietly bled New York's economy for decades. Investigators planted bugs in union offices, restaurants, and even social clubs where mobsters met. One famous bug was hidden inside the Rave Night Social Club, a Gambino family hangout in Little Italy. Through months of recordings, the FBI gathered enough evidence to prove that the Mafia's Commission, the ruling council of the five families, was orchestrating a nationwide criminal network. Then, in 1985, the unthinkable happened. Federal prosecutors, led by Rudy Giuliani, launched the Mafia Commission Trial, the most ambitious case against organized crime in American history. For the first time, the bosses of the five families, Paul Castellano, Gambino, Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno, Genovese, Carmen, The Snake, Persico Colombo, Anthony Corallo, Lucchese, and Philip Rastelli Bonanno were all indicted together. The charges were staggering: extortion, labor racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and murder. Prosecutors claimed that these men, acting as the board of directors of organized crime, had taxed New York's industries through fear and corruption. Every business, every contract, every shipment that passed through the city carried a hidden cost, the mob's cut. The trial became a national spectacle. For the first time, Americans saw the inner workings of the mafia laid bare. Recordings of mob meetings played in courtrooms, revealing the bosses' voices discussing construction deals, payoffs, and union problems. The myth of the untouchable gangster began to crumble. In 1987, after months of testimony, all the defendants were convicted. The Mafia Commission, the very heart of the five families' power, was dismantled. Dozens of mob bosses and captains received lengthy prison sentences. The once invincible mafia empire had been brought to its knees. But even as the bosses fell, the mafia's grip didn't disappear overnight. The mob tax was too deeply rooted in the city's economy to vanish instantly. Some capos and underbosses tried to keep the system alive, but constant FBI pressure and the rise of new technologies made secrecy impossible. The age of quiet envelopes and handshake deals was ending. The assassination of Paul Castellano in 1985 marked a violent shift. Ordered by John Gotti, the ambitious Gambino underboss, the hit took place in front of Manhattan's Sparks Steakhouse, a bold public act that shocked the nation. Gotti, soon dubbed the Teflon Don, for his ability to avoid conviction, became the face of a new, flamboyant mafia. But his reign was short-lived. In 1992, thanks to evidence provided by his underboss Sammy, the Bull, Gravano, Gotti was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to life in prison. That betrayal, Gravano turning government witness, symbolized the true end of the old mafia code. The sacred vow of omerta had been broken. Once that silence fell, the entire foundation of mafia power began to collapse. Throughout the 1990s, the FBI continued dismantling what remained of the mob tax system. Union after union was seized from mafia control. Construction companies that once paid protection money now operated under government oversight. Federal judges, city officials, and labor boards imposed reforms that made it nearly impossible for the five families to dominate as they once had. By the early 2000s, the mafia's influence in New York was a shadow of its former self. The mob tax, the engine that had powered organized crime for half a century, had finally been neutralized. No longer could the mafia dictate the price of concrete, the hiring of workers, or the outcome of bids. The era of the silent tax collectors was over. Yet, even in decline, the mafia's legacy remained. Its history became myth, immortalized in films, books, and shows like American Godfathers, The Five Families. The story of the mob tax wasn't just about crime, it was about human ambition, greed, and the dangerous allure of power. The mafia once controlled New York not just through violence, but through a system that mimicked legitimate governance, rules, hierarchy, loyalty, and order. It was a shadow version of capitalism, built on the same desire for profit and control, only enforced by fear instead of law. For many, the downfall of the mob was bittersweet. Some old-timers mourned the loss of order in neighborhoods once ruled by mafia figures who, despite their crimes, maintained stability. But for others, it was liberation, a chance for honest workers, businesses, and unions to operate without paying tribute to a criminal empire. Today, remnants of the five families still exist, operating in much smaller, quieter ways. But the days of the mob tax, when New York's skyline rose on mafia money and fear, are long gone. The rise and fall of the mob tax tell a larger story, not just about the mafia, but about America itself. It's a story of how power corrupts, how greed spreads, and how justice, though slow, eventually catches up. The five families once ruled New York like kings, their hands in every deal, every dollar, every dream. But in the end, their empire collapsed under its own weight, undone by betrayal, arrogance, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The mob tax had built an empire. The law tore it down. And as the city moved on, the echoes of that dark economy still linger, in whispers, in memories, and in the old men who once ruled the streets of New York. CO title: The Fall of the Mob Tax. How the Five Families Empire Collapsed. American Godfathers S1. CO description: Explore how the mafia's mob tax empire came crashing down, from FBI wiretaps to the historic Mafia Commission trial that ended New York's underworld reign. Keywords: Mob tax, NYC Mafia, 5 families, American Godfathers, RICO Act, Mafia Commission Trial, John Gotti, Paul Castellano, Organized Crime, Mafia Downfall. Giuliani, FBI Surveillance, True Crime Documentary. Hashtags. Hashtag Mafia History, hashtag American Godfathers, hashtag 5 Families, hashtag Mob Tax, hashtag True Crime, hashtag NYC Mafia, hashtag RICO Act, hashtag John Gotti, hashtag FBI, hashtag Organized Crime, hashtag NYC History, hashtag Crime Documentary.